T.S. Eliot is an American poet, playwright, editor, and literary critic. As George Watson remarks, Eliot made English criticism look different, but not in a simple sense. Eliot is hard to understand, but not for the reasons most people think. He is hard to understand because there is a tension between his intellectual beliefs and his poetry. On one hand, his poetry represents an obvious formal departure from virtually all poetry that preceded him. His literary techniques and some of his subject matter were strikingly unconventional. It does not take a higher degree to recognize this. Thus, Eliot is labeled a modernist. His champions regard him as the quintessential figure in the modernist art movement. Modernism has been defined as a revolt against the past above everything else. Yet, Eliot was not a political or intellectual rebel. He was genuinely religious and socially conservative, almost obsessed with history and with literary traditions. He was erudite to an extent that people today, even academics, would find him hard to fathom. His ideas about literature do not reflect the desire to break conventions or move forward that we generally associate with modernism. His literary criticism and other prose writings all emphasize the importance of maintaining strict connections to the poetic canon. He thought that artists only create art after they have developed what he calls the historical sense. He talks about depersonalization as the artist's ability to realize their individual insignificance next to the whole of what came before them. So this is the reason why Eliot, along with Yeats, is considered as an anti-modernist. So thus there is an apparent conflict between Eliot's conservative outlook and his formally innovative poetry. But Eliot should not be stripped of his modernist label. We can rather amend the term modernism instead. This qualification is important because the modernist label carries connotations that simply do not do justice to Eliot. For example, the label implies that modernists wanted to move forward away from the past. Eliot wanted to move backwards, partly because he felt other artists had left past behind. In an essay introducing the early 20th century modernists, the Norton Anthology of British Literature describes T.S. Eliot's critical and creative projects as efforts to reinvent poetry. This is exactly the opposite of what he was doing. He wanted to stop people from trying to reinvent poetry, because he thought doing so would only lead to bad poems. How can the editors of the Norton Anthology, the closest thing I know to the record of academic consensus, so completely misunderstand Eliot's project? They fail to appreciate the relationship between Eliot's literary ideas and his attitude towards modernity. I believe the best way to think about Eliot's intellectual project is as an effort to save poetry from the threatening forces of modernity and modernism. The modernist movement and Eliot's ideas are both responses to the same set of dramatic historical changes. Europe transformed itself from 1890 to 1918 in the context of drastic political, technological, and social changes described by historians as the emergence of modernity. Europe's dominant artistic and intellectual value systems reoriented itself in favor of newness and forward movement. T.S. Eliot had a different response to historical change. He felt the ongoing historical transformation, self-perpetuated by the resultant emphasis on progress, threatened to uproot and destroy England's literary tradition. So he took it on himself to save that tradition. Therefore, to understand him, one of the crucial essays that we need to read is Tradition and Individual Talent, written in 1919 in The Egoist. This essay talks about how poetry should follow tradition, and poetry should be impersonal. This essay is divided into 3 parts. It gives us Eliot's concept of tradition in the first part, and the second part is developed in his theory of impersonality of poetry. And third part is just a summing up of what he believes. So Eliot says that the word tradition is a word that is disagreeable to the English, who praise the poet for those aspects of his work which are individual and original. This undue stress on individuality shows that the English have an uncritical mind. The best and the most individual parts of the poet's work is that which shows the maximum influence of the writers of the past. Tradition does not mean a blind adherence to or slavish imitation of the ways of the previous generations. Tradition, in the true sense of the term, cannot be inherited. It can only be obtained by hard labor. It can be obtained by those who have the historical sense. Historical sense involves a perception that the past exists in the present, and that the past and the present form one simultaneous order. This historical sense is the sense of the timeless and the temporal, as well as the timeless and the temporal together. A writer with the sense of tradition is fully conscious of his own generation, of his place in the present, but he's also acutely conscious of his relationship with the writers of the past. Eliot further points out that no writer has his value and significance in isolation. The work of a poet in the present is to be compared and contrasted with works of the past and judged by the standards of the past. This comparison is essential for estimating the real worth and significance of a new writer and his work. Eliot's conception of tradition is a dynamic one. He believes that tradition is not anything fixed and static. It is a constantly changing thing. But just as the past directs and guides the present, so the present alters and modifies the past. When a new work of art is created, the whole literary tradition is modified. Every great poet like Virgil or Dante or Shakespeare has added something to the literary tradition out of which the future poetry will be written. According to him, the poet must be aware that the mind of Europe is a mind which changes, and this change is a development which abandons nothing. Now, this line has come under a lot of heat. People believe that Eliot's conception of a mind of Europe is problematic because it valorizes Western European culture and showcases that Western literature lies above other cultural contributions. This Eurocentrism can be seen as reflecting a broader cultural elitism within modernism, which often grounded itself in classical illusions and high cultural references accessible primarily to the classically educated upper classes. For instance, Eliot's own literary criticism emphasizes the centrality of European literary tradition, as seen in his assertion that the whole of literature of Europe, from Homer, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This perspective implicitly marginalizes non-European cultures and literatures, echoing imperialistic impulses of the British Empire during Eliot's time. Another problem with his idea of the mind of Europe is his resistance to social and cultural change. This is particularly evident in his advocacy for a hierarchical social order, and his critique of what he saw as the moral and cultural decline of contemporary society. For example, in The Idea of Christian Society, Eliot laments the loss of a unified Christian culture. From here, we can also see that his idea of the mind of Europe is highly focused on Christianity. His religious exclusivism further compounds the problematic nature of his mind of Europe. His emphasis on Christianity, particularly Anglicanism, as the cornerstone of European culture, can be seen as exclusionary in a pluralistic society that values religious diversity and secularism. His perspective is evident in his assertion that the culture of Europe is essentially Christian, which marginalizes non-Christian and secular contributions to European culture, and suggests that non-Christian influences are secondary or inferior. Finally, we can also see that his idea of the mind of Europe is anti-Semitic. His works exhibit racial and cultural insensitivity, reflecting broader issues of xenophobia and anti-Semitism. His book, Burbank with a Baedeker, includes anti-Semitic imagery of stereotypes. The rats are underneath the piles, the Jew is underneath the lot. And his portrayal of women often reflect traditional and patriarchal views, with female characters depicted in limited and stereotypical roles. This is particularly evident in his portrayal of women in The Wasteland, where female characters are often shown as passive or degraded. In the second section of the essay, he talks about the impersonality of poetry. According to Eliot, the artist must continually surrender himself to something which is more valuable than himself, that is, the literary tradition. In the beginning, the artist's self, his individuality, may assert itself, but as his powers mature, there must be greater and greater extension of personality. He must acquire greater and greater objectivity. A good poem is a living whole of all poetry that has ever been written. The progress of the artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extension of personality. So therefore, the artist must be as impersonal and as objective as a scientist. Eliot compares the mind of the poet to a catalyst, and the process of poetic creation to the process of a chemical reaction. When a piece of platinum is introduced into a vapor chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide, the two combine to form sulfuric acid, but the platinum remains unchanged. The poet's mind is this platinum, the catalytic agent. The emotions and feelings are sulfur and oxygen. The poet's mind is necessary for new combinations of emotions and experiences to take place, but it itself does not undergo any change during the process of poetic combination. The personality of the poet does not find expression in his poetry. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. This impersonality can be achieved only by a sense of tradition, the historic sense. The third part finally talks about poetic emotion. There is always a difference between artistic emotion and personal emotions of the poet. His personal emotions may be simple or crude, but the emotions of his poetry are complex and refined. He may express ordinary emotions, but he must impart to them a new significance and a new meaning. Even emotions which he has never personally experienced can serve the purpose of poetry. In the poetic process, there is only concentration of a number of experiences, and a new thing results from this concentration. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may find no place in his poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may have no significance for the man. Eliot thus rejects romantic subjectivism and Wordsworth's theory of poetry as emotions recollected in tranquility. He does not deny personality or emotion, only that he must depersonalize his emotions, for emotion of art is impersonal. This can be done by the use of a set of conceptual symbols or correlatives which endeavor to express the emotions of the poet. Which brings me to our next essay, Hamlet and His Problems, where Eliot discusses his idea of the objective correlative. Eliot's doctrine of poetic impersonality finds its most classic formulation in the concept of objective correlative. He believes that the poet cannot communicate his emotions directly to the readers. He must find some objects or medium suggestive of it to evoke the same emotion in his readers. This objective correlative is something that he has borrowed from the idea of the extended metaphor, so it is a metaphysical element of his poetry. The objective correlative has also been derived from the theory and practice of French symbolists and the writings of French critic Rémy de Gourmont. It is through the objective correlative that the transaction between the author and the reader necessarily takes place. An example of a good objective correlative from Shakespeare would be Macbeth, where the dramatist has to convey the mental agony of Lady Macbeth, and he does so in the sleep-waking scene. Not through direct description, but through an unconscious repetition of her past actions. Her mental agony has been made objective. But in Hamlet, there is no object to express the inner anguish of the Prince of Denmark. The disgust of Hamlet is inexpressible, because it is in excess of facts as presented in the drama. And herein lies the artistic failure of Hamlet. Spanish tragedy, or Kidd's Hamlet, is a different version of Hamlet that was acted in Germany in Shakespeare's lifetime. Shakespeare's Hamlet bears strong evidence of having been adapted from this play. It is clear that in Kidd's Hamlet, the motive was a revenge motive simply. That the action or delay is caused, as in the Spanish tragedy, solely by the difficulty of assassinating a monarch surrounded by guards, and that the madness of Hamlet was feigned in order to escape suspicion. In the final play of Shakespeare, on the other hand, there is a motive which is more important than that of revenge. The delay in revenge is unexplained on grounds of necessity or expediency, and the effect of the madness is not to lull but to arouse the king's suspicion. This alteration is not complete enough to be convincing. Furthermore, there are verbal parallels so close to Spanish tragedy as to leave no doubt that in places Shakespeare was merely revising the text of Kidd. And finally, there are unexplained scenes, like the Polonius Laertes and the Polonius Reynaldo scenes, for which there is little excuse. Hamlet, like the sonnets, is full of some stuff that the writer could not drag to light, contemplate, or manipulate into art. The only way of expressing emotions in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In the character Hamlet, it is the buffoonery of an emotion which can find no outlet in action. In the dramatist, it is the buffoonery of an emotion which he cannot express in art. The intense feeling, without an object or exceeding its object, is something which every person of sensibility has known. The ordinary person puts these feelings to sleep to fit the business of the world. The artist keeps us alive by his ability to intensify the world to his emotions. Our next essay is The Metaphysical Poets, written in 1921 in Times Literary Supplement. Here, Eliot talks about two things: unification of sensibility and disassociation of sensibility. Unification of sensibility is a fusion of thought and feeling, and it is essential for good poetry. It is the harmonious working of creative and critical faculties of a poet. A great poet must, of necessity, be a great critic as well. Bad poetry results when there is disassociation of sensibility, that is, the poet is unable to feel his thoughts, and there is a split between thought and feeling. According to Eliot, in the late 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility had set in with the onset of rationalism. The influence of Milton and Dryden and Pope, who composed their poetry from their wit and not their soul, had been particularly harmful in this respect. There are attempts at unification of thought and feeling in Keats and Shelley, but the Victorian poets failed to transmute ideas into emotions and sensations. Tennyson and Browning are poets, and they think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. A mature poet can experience or feel his thoughts as he does the odor of a rose. In other words, there is a sensuous apprehension of thought in good poetry. Merely dry thoughts or logic do not make a great poet. Eliot's concept of dissociation of sensibility has thus been of far-reaching influence in modern criticism. Now let's come to his final essay, The Three Voices of Poetry, written in 1953. In Three Voices of the Poetry, Eliot deals with this gamut. Lyric is the first voice, dramatic monologue is the second voice, and drama is the third voice. So Eliot held the view that the language of poetry must approximate the spoken language and advocated the use of free verse. In fact, he believed that each poem should have a distinctive voice. If one is writing for the stage, then the approach would be certainly different from verse writing, that is to be read or recited. The voice must be in tune of what is being said. The first voice, lyric. This is a point where the hero tells his tale directly. Eliot believes that it is an illusion to think that there is such a voice as that of a poet talking to one person, even though there are poems addressed to particular people, like epistles. There is a certain amount of overhearing expected. Even though a love poem may be addressed to one person, it is meant to be overheard by others, for Eliot finds prose more suited to private discourse with one's beloved. In imaginative verse, the poet writes not to be listened, but to purge himself of the emotions, using the best words. He does not know what he has to say until he has said it, and in the effort to say it, he is not concerned with making other people understand anything. According to Eliot, a psychic material causes the poet to feel the urge to convey something through this poem. Here, poetry has no fixed shape, and it is only after it is written that the final structure is seen. Now, this is not the case with the second and the third voice, which we'll be discussing, because in those, there are some preconceived form, which is adhered to. Even the modifications in the process of its creation may creep in. The second voice is the dramatic monologue, and it is hard to master, because here the character has to blend to the writer's view, and the writer should not show any character for himself. There is no check on the poet while writing a dramatic monologue, as he deals with one particular character that needs only to identify with him, or vice versa. There is no second character that has to be replied to or set at variance. The only thing you need to remember is that the person that you're choosing for a dramatic monologue has to be a personage which is identified to us, maybe because he is a historical persona or a very popular fiction character. So therefore he should be known to us before he begins to speak. If the poet only speaks in his own voice, a character cannot be brought to life, because then only mimicry is taking place. When we read or listen to Shakespeare's plays, we aren't listening to his voice, but that of his characters. Now let's come to the third voice. The third voice is where the writer identifies himself with the characters, but he also has to find the ways to make the communication taking place between these fictitious characters seem plausible. When you're dealing with a verse play, a writer has a varied range of characters to give speech to, and these characters vary in temperament, background, education, and intelligence. Due to this, the writer cannot single out one character for identification with and bestow all the important lines or poetry to it. Take, for example, Jane Austen's writing. All her characters have some say or the other and move the plot onwards. None of them pose as mere furniture. A character cannot be a mere mouthpiece, as it will bring to notice the artificial aspect of the play, and drama is a suspension of belief. Eliot further elaborates that to make character actually seem alive is not possible just by words alone, but also by sympathy, which is excited in the writer's breast for that character. A novelist has more scope to manipulate a character, but a dramatist is hard to put, due to the lack of time and space provided. The author may bestow some of his own traits to the character, and also may, to a certain extent, be influenced by the character, driving this poetry so that there is a variation in the style suited to the character that speaks it. Now let's talk about Eliot's modern sublime. Eliot's modern sublime refers to the way he reinterprets the traditional concept of the sublime within the context of modern literature. In Eliot's poetry, especially in works like The Wasteland and the Four Quartets, the sublime is transformed into something more fragmented, paradoxical, and tied to the disillusionments of the modern world. Let's look at certain key features of Eliot's modern sublime. In traditional romantic sublime, there is a feeling of awe, grandeur, or transcendence often associated with nature, the divine, the overwhelming experiences. Eliot's sublime is not found in vast landscapes or divine visions, but in complex meditations on time, memory, and existence. His sublime arises from the paradox of time, where moments of transcendence that occur within temporal boundaries are present. 2. The modernist sublime often take place in mundane settings, like the draughty church or the rose garden in Burnt Norton, where brief flashes of transcendence hint at something larger and ineffable. 3. Unlike the romantic sublime, where nature often serves as a gateway to the divine, Eliot's modernist sublime reflects a spiritual longing in a world where traditional religious and metaphysical structures are breaking down. His characters yearn for meaning, for connection to the eternal, but their search is complicated by the fragmentation of modernity. Eliot locates the sublime in moments of fragmentation, where transcendence is sought but often elusive. In Four Quartets, the sublime is the still point, which represents a moment of spiritual or metaphysical insight, yet grounded in the tension between time and eternity, motion and stillness. This spiritual insight is obtained in stillness, and the moments of spiritual insight are called epiphanies. The sublime is tied to the idea of unity of the human with the divine, yet always infused with the awareness of human limitations. 4. Eliot's use of language itself contributes to the modernist sublime. His fragmented, layered, and elusive poetic form mirrors the fragmented world that he lives in, yet it seeks to reach moments of sublime unity or meaning through these very disruptions. In his use of illusion, shifts in voices, and a collage of various images, Eliot constructs a sublime that emerges from the interplay of fragmentation and coherence. As I said in the beginning of this video, Eliot is a poet who's hard to understand. He is difficult, and he's often misunderstood. But I have tried to compact everything that you must know and understand about Eliot in this little video. If you like this video, check out this list of other modernist poets.